I'm going to need that water, John. Thank you.
All right, we are now live. And how are you? Good evening, Mr. Nader. It's good to see you.
Same
Uh,
here.
I was so excited about having this conversation with you. This is regarding Ralph's new book, Rebellious CEO, by Ralph Nader. It's writing backwards. I have to mirror it, so I'll have to change that. But anyway, it's a new book that he writes called Rebellious CEO, which we'll be talking about. For those of you, of course, that know Ralph Nader, Ralph is a good friend, and he's had some serious groundbreaking work that he's done that helped us drive safer cars, eat healthier food, breathe better air, drink cleaner water, work in safer spaces. He has inspired generations of consumer advocates, citizen activists, and public interest lawyers. A lot of young people that are out in the street today, in fact, on many levels, have been inspired by you, Ralph. So thank you so much for being here, and thank you for continuing to be so active and so involved. Retirement is far away for you, it seems.
Very much. We're
Yeah.
seeing we're seeing a movement of a lot of young people who never were engaged before on a number of issues, from climate to the slaughter in Gaza now, and civil rights, civil liberties. They're learning civic skills, learning how to protest, uh, learning nonviolent civil disobedience. Now they got to learn more functional civic skills to build new institutions all over the country, sort of a new forest of democratic oak trees.
Yeah, there was an upsurge in that kind of movement for a while, and then there was a little bit of a slowdown. Do you see a resurgence of that now with all the stuff that's happening around the world, with climate change, with wars, with all of the things that are taking place, the elections, and how our government officials are not accountable to so many things? Do you see an upsurge in engagement by young people and others?
Yeah, there is clearly, and the news reports verify that. They're getting smarter in their demonstrations. They're not just demonstrating back home. They're going to the source of the obstruction of justice and peace in the world, like Congress, like political party headquarters, like banks. And I think Jewish Voice for Peace is breaking new ground with Grand Central Station peaceful demonstration that never happened before. They did it at the Statue of Liberty. They're getting more and more skilled, and justice is a lot about skilled civic action, not just having the right issue or having the right solution.
Today they're blocking the Bay Bridge in San Francisco. People are stopping their cars and throwing their keys in the bay.
Yeah, and they're educating themselves by the backlash, by the intransigence of the overwhelming number members of Congress who just can't seem to understand that they can't continue in the old ways with PAC money and all the same old lobbyists. And now there's a backlash that's really alarming law students all over the country. Apparently, a a large number of large corporate law firms have just issued a statement saying that any of the new potential recruits from law school joining their law firm is critical of Israel or what's going on over there, they're not going to hire them. So the people who are on the frontiers of justice, they learn from the backlash. They get more determined. They get more learned. They get more uh, knowing that it's a long haul. It's not just a weekend of activism, and they begin seeing where the opposition really is. The law firms like to stay in the background. These corporate law firms. This is remarkable that they're right out in front now with their reverse bigotry and trying to basically uh, blacklist law students at Columbia, Harvard, Yale, Berkeley, elsewhere.
Do you see the lawsuits prevailing in that situation? I know that the ADC and Palestine Legal and others are fighting to, write some of those things. But do you see those types of things prevailing? Under what grounds?
Well, the lawsuits against the law firms, the law firms will say, we have a right to choose free speech. But there is a law professor in Ohio who thinks that if they are engaging in a tight collusion, they are the buyers of the services of these law students, that there could be an antitrust issue.
Mm. Let's talk about the book right now, and then we can come back to some other issues. But this book, The Rebellious CEO, it's about 12 leaders who did it right. And they're quite a variety of them. I have the honor to be one of them. I really was quite surprised, taken back by it, but I really do appreciate it. And I have to say, I was reading it, and a lot of times people write stuff about you, but there are facts that are left out, or facts that are like not necessarily true. And I was really surprised at how accurate it was. So whoever was doing the editing got it exactly right. There wasn't one mistake that I could find, and I could speak firsthand, of course, about my chapter.
Well, ever since I saw that little restaurant you started on P Street called Skewers, and I looked at the menu down by the sidewalk and said, "Holy smoke, this is Arab cuisine." Good hummus, but
Right.
gin and all the rest, Sheikh al-Mahshi. And so people would come by, tourists, and they'd be looking for a restaurant, and they'd be gaping. And I'd say, "You want nutritious food? There's your diet, but it happens to also be delicious." And
well, I actually remember it quite starkly, but when we weren't very busy at the beginning when we first opened. We were trying to get the business in, trying to get reviews and all of that. And I remember you used to come there, of course, on a regular basis. Your office was across the street, but you would come in on your way out. You'd see some people standing looking at the menu, because we were on a kind of an upstairs, about a half a floor. And you would look at them and say, "The food is good, go up there." And people would turn around and say, "Was that Ralph Nader?" They didn't know when they walked in. But it was a pretty good endorsement to come from, the consumer advocate that you are, to tell them this is a good place to go to. And I remember so many things happened there. Of course, we were. It wasn't just a restaurant; it was an activist center in so many ways, right?
mm,
That's what made it unique, and that's probably what drew you to it.
yeah, the top floor turned into a modest little bookstore, since elaborated in your 8 restaurants. Every one of your restaurants has a bookstore, a dining area, and then what I call a civic room, where you can dine, but you also listen to poetry, watch people debate important controversial issues, politicians arguing their case. You even had presidential debates for third parties there.
Yeah.
And you also had the first debate ever on the question, is anti-Semitism against Arab Americans more frequent than anti-Semitism against Jewish Americans? That was a very civil debate. In fact, we put it on a website called debatingtaboos.org. Anybody who wants to listen to it, and it's rather current in the present situation. And then you started inviting authors, and you had Howard Zinn, Professor Howard Zinn.
That was the first time that I met him.
And Cornel West.
And Jesse Jackson, and so many others, Marion Barry. There was. I remember when Howard first came in, and the room was crackling with excitement. And he walked up the stairs. It was like a superstar just walked in the room, and people just broke into applause. And he went on talking for a couple of hours. It was a small, intimate space that that held maybe 40 people. We had it jammed with 100 people that day. People were sitting on the stairs. If we had a fire marshal walk in, they would have probably stopped the event. But luckily, nothing bad happened. But still, it was an incredible opportunity to meet such incredible people up close and personal.
Well, that was the launch pad for your model. I mean, one of the reasons I selected you in this book, The Rebellious CEO, was you broke the model of what a restaurant should be like. and it's a community center. You got so much news for all the events you planned. You now have an event almost every evening that you didn't have to advertise. You'd
Yep.
open up a restaurant and they'd line up on opening day. And it was very multiracial, and the food was good and reasonable price. But the distinctiveness is that you didn't just listen to all these events and participate and introduce. You were all over the District of Columbia. You marched with peace marchers. You protested the criminal invasion of your ancestral country, Iraq, by Bush and Cheney. I remember once in 1995, you poured the French wine in your restaurant down the sink in protest of the French government starting nuclear bomb tests in the South Pacific.
Yep.
So, I have a page in the book where I ask the question, where is Andy Shallal? And the answer is everywhere. You're at city council meetings. You're at gathering places. You're trying to take the lead in the restaurant business, which can be very tight and overly unimaginative. That's why I called you democracy's restaurateur.
So there's a common thread, of course, with all the CEOs that you write about, and it is really about more than just the business they're in. It's more about creating that social change, creating that activism, looking at a problem that needs solving, and using the business to help to figure it out and solve it through business as social entrepreneurs. So that is a common thread.
Let's talk about some of them. Yeah.
Okay.
One of them, obviously, a lot of your viewers or listeners know, is Yvon Chouinard of Patagonia. That's a private company. It doesn't have public stockholders. So they are very innovative, and they don't have to waste time with Wall Street analysts badgering them about the next quarterly earnings report. And he started out as a climber, a mountain climber. He didn't like the equipment. It was not only unsafe, but it corroded the areas. Like if you would climb El Capitan in Yosemite, it would start shattering. So he invented climbing gear. And then someone said, there are a lot of climbers, and why don't you go into business? So he got a garage, and he started his business, and he kept refining his climbing gear by his own experience and by feedback from all the people who bought it. Then he went to outdoor equipment and clothing, and it's the best product you can imagine. I mean, he treats his workers so well that he demands that they go surfing during lunch off Santa Barbara. And, Let My Surfers Go was the title of his first book. and they love working there because he branches out. And he was very, very early on global warming, on environmental protection. He would go all over the world taking people on climbing trips, surfing. He'd go to Indonesia for a trip with conservationists and show them the real thing, what's going on there in terms of the ocean. And he would then establish standards for his suppliers in Asia because they weren't treating their workers very well. He would have labor standards as well. And he wrote a book called Corporate Responsibility. He never complained about environmental regulation. Most of these CEOs, they never complained about regulation because they were way ahead of them, as I'll discuss in a minute. They were way ahead of EPA or OSHA or other regulatory agencies. Well, recently in his 80s, Yvon Chouinard gave the whole company to a trust. And the trustees are the executives of the company to further the legacy. During the Trump administration, when Trumpsters were going after the public lands and trying to privatize or corporatize them, he put in full-page ads. He organized the outdoor recreation industry, which is many, many tens of billions of dollars. They put their names of their companies in the ad. Then he filed a major lawsuit against the Trump administration. for what they were trying to do. So he's the real thing. Another one that was spectacular was Anita Roddick. I don't know if she ever was at Busboys and Poets, but
I don't remember seeing her. She's the head of the Body Shop. She
right,
founded the Body Shop. Yeah.
she co-founded the Body Shop in England because she was desperate for money, and she started one or two shops, and then just expanded to 600, 700 franchise shops all over the UK and the world. And I don't think that I've ever met anybody like her. I mean, you just have to read her books, by the way. They're so graphic and gripping. She was a devastating critic of global corporations and the cosmetic industry and how they exploited women in their crazed definition of beauty as skin deep.
Looking her up right now. She writes. She writes here. Thus are women enslaved by images of beauty and glamour, gazing out at them from every advertising hoarding, every glossy magazine, every television commercial, enslaved to a never-ending struggle to attain some unattainable standard of perfection. And she continues by preying on women's fears of lost youth, diminishing appeal, and fading beauty. The false hopes offered by the cosmetic industry can only result in misery, demoralization, and a deep-rooted sense of inadequacy. And that's what keeps these businesses in business, by making people feel less than. In fact, they're creating, as she mentioned here, creating perfumes for babies, for little infants almost. Just, it's crazy.
Yeah, well, she was much more beyond the cosmetic industry. For example, she went down to Angola jail in Louisiana with civil rights people because several prisoners were incarcerated in solitary confinement for over 40 years. She championed their cause. Then she heard when the communist regime Romania collapsed that there was a huge area of orphans and little kids who were abandoned. And she heard that they were being exposed to the elements and to lice and not being fed. She flies in with a crew of people to Romania and hires everybody to clean up and healthcare, nurses and everything. And then when she comes back, she establishes a permanent trust to support these orphans. So she was into creating institutions. When she got supplies from indigenous tribes in the Amazon and elsewhere, she would go there to make sure that they were not going to be exploited. They weren't going to be inundated with corporate economy type values, and she gave them a good reward. But the most amazing thing was what she did with her workers. She not only had posters and all kinds of activist material by citizen groups in her shops, but she insisted that their workers pick a cause that they believe in and advance that cause on company time. She was a tremendous defender of people who came down with AIDS. She heard about a Scottish town that lost its major industrial employer. She goes up there. She starts a supply company for the Body Shop with 200 workers. It's just nothing in terms of the breadth and depth. Now, Ray Anderson of Interface Corporation, who's the largest manufacturer of carpet tile in the world, factories out of Atlanta, Georgia, he was listening to a lecture by Paul Hawken, who's one of the CEOs in the book as well. And in 1994, and Hawken basically said, look, if business doesn't get its business in order environmentally, it's going to bring down the world, not only them. And it's going to demoralize their own workers. And he had a book called The Ecology of Commerce, which is still being used in business schools. Paul Hawken did. Well, Ray Anderson, who is the CEO, he founded the company. He's 61 years old, and he's an engineer. He goes back, gets his team around the table, and he said, you're not going to recognize this company in 15 years. And they said, what do you mean? He said, we're going carbon neutral. We're going to not only reduce our water, we're not only going to get rid of our chemicals, but we are going to end up with a marketing model where we're going to recycle the carpets. So people wear out the carpets and businesses, in other words, we're going to recycle them, and they're not going to be able to throw them away. We'll cut that kind of contract with him. Well, he was taken away from us by prostate cancer in 2011.
Mm.
I called him the greatest CEO of our generation. You got to read his books to see the range of his thinking and how many speeches he gave to businesses and challenged them, including companies like Walmart, to reduce their packaging. At any rate, Interface became carbon neutral in 2019, and now they're going for carbon negativity, to be carbon negative. So a lot of these groups, a lot of these CEOs, and you don't get any publicity. Saul Price, for example, people heard of the Price Club because it was a precursor to Sam's Club and Costco, and he was the founder of the Big Box Club. But he was a lawyer out of California, grew up in a Jewish neighborhood in New York City. Among his other concerns was the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. He struck up a friendship with Teddy Kollek, who is the mayor of Jerusalem, and it's quite amazing. Kollek asked him to raise funds for one of his projects, and Saul Price refused, and he sent him the following letter. Given today's circumstances, it's worth reading a minute of his letter to Teddy Kollek, mayor of Jerusalem. Quote, I am involved in trying to get a dialogue going between Palestinians and Israelis. In addition, I'm trying to determine how best to give some economic aid to Palestinians so that they can develop more economic independence. More important, I'm trying to make it respectable to discuss openly in the Jewish and non-Jewish community different approaches, including discussions with the PLO, that's the Palestine Liberation Organization, without being tainted as anti-Semitic, anti-Israel, or anti-American, end quote. And he would fund scholarships for Israeli Arabs to go to law school at Tel Aviv University Law School. He would give other assistance for job training for Palestinian Arabs. And he didn't care what his Jewish friends in the business world said about him, excoriated him. One of the themes of all these CEOs is they really didn't care what the business community said to them or criticized them. It's not that, they didn't get feedback. It's that they sort of saw them as retrograde, just out of sync with the necessities of people in the world. The interesting thing about Gino Paolucci, who sold Chinese food, as you know, started 70 companies, including some in his 90s. He insisted on having labor unions in his restaurants and in his food processing plants, even when there was no movement to start a union. Mm. He would insist on it because he came from the hard scrabble area of the Iron Range in Minnesota, which is incredibly poor. I mean, stories he tells about his dad, they were Italian immigrants, but how they were treated. If they even mentioned the word union, they would be fired and blacklisted from all the mine companies in the area, which is almost condemning them to semi-starvation. And they never forgot where he came from. Then there's Bo Rapport, American Income Life Insurance Company out of Waco, Texas. He probably went to Busboys and Poets on occasions. He's come to Washington a lot because he'd be talking a lot with senators and representatives. He was a lobbyist for civil liberties and civil rights and a lot of other good projects. He not only insisted that there be a union in his life insurance company. Unions in insurance companies are unheard of, even today. He not only insisted, he joined the union himself. So these are some of the characteristics. They were all never procrastinated, obviously, because entrepreneurs don't do that and succeed. They often procrastinated. They did things even before the deadline for achieving certain goals. But it all started with a vision about what they want to do with their business. And then they said, but we're not going to make profit unless we treat our workers well, treat our consumers well, treat the environment well, and be upstanding citizens speaking out publicly on injustices. And Gino Paolucci would spend time getting prisoners out of jail who were railroaded without due process or adequate evidence. That's a very strenuous exercise. It takes a strong emotional toll. He didn't mind. He looked around. He saw all these Italian Americans prominent in Washington and in business, and he said, "You haven't started an Italian American foundation. Why don't you start your own ethnic foundation?" Which he did with a huge, a huge opening day at the Washington Hilton. He was everywhere. There were other characteristics too. All of them came from stable families. I mean, they weren't predisposed to having a lot of emotional problems at home when they went home after work. All of them would admit their mistakes in public. You did that too when you had a couple restaurants that didn't make it near DuPont Circle. You didn't restrain by telling people why it failed, and they all had that attitude of speaking out and thinking out loud in their public. Gordon Sherman, who built Midas Muffler, criticized the auto companies. He said, "I hate to give great mufflers fast to people who come into my shop because of where the muffler ends up in these gas guzzling, unsafe, stylistic monsters that are damaging the planet Earth." But he did more than that. He gave a speech at my sister's class, Laura Nader at Berkeley, anthropology. And I print that speech, most of it, in the book. You'll never hear a speech by a CEO like that. Mm. He was a classical major at the University of Chicago and never forgot his studies and his broad frame of reference, as well as an acute insight into the foibles of corporate executives that he had to deal with. Again, he started a major group that works to this day of public interest lawyers in Chicago. He would have done a lot more, but his father, who started the business, was very conservative. And when Gordon Sherman invited me to the Hoi Polloi Business Club luncheon in Chicago, and he walked me slowly past the tables as they looked up and saw, what the hell is Gordon Sherman doing with this guy? His father got very upset with a lot of Gordon's policies and wrested the company away from him. Mm. And at the time, he just learned he came down with leukemia. So he left and lived in Mill Valley, California, where he was a extraordinary skilled birder. I once asked him, "How are you, Gordon?" He said, "Well, I'm fine. Dying is a great way to live." So they
remarkable.
Yeah. And Herb Kelleher, who started Southwest Airlines. Okay. I was a real supporter of Southwest Airlines. I liked the way they immediately answered the phone with human beings. They had reasonable fares. They greeted you authentically when you got on the plane. They always had a way to say yes. Delta often had employees who had a way to say no. They had a way to say yes. So I became friends with Herb, and I once asked him, I like the way you treat customers first, Herb. He said, "I don't treat customers first." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "I treat my people first." He never used the word employees. Yeah. He said, "If you treat your people properly and motivate them and support them with good livelihoods and retirement and unions, they will treat their customers superbly. And if they treat their customers superbly, more people are going to fly Southwest, and that'll make our shareholders happy." So that was a way that a lot of these CEOs reversed the business model. They reversed it.
That seemed like a no-brainer.
Yeah. Well, it was a no-brainer, but Amazon did exactly the opposite. They had this vision of undercutting booksellers and then others, and they crunched the workers
Mm.
to keep their expenses down. And they didn't do that well, except for expeditious delivery with communities and their own consumers. I mean, getting rid of small business, hollowing out uh, small towns and elsewhere is not my idea of responsible business. And of course, now they're invading people's privacy. They're going to start drone deliveries. How about that?
Yeah.
Crashing drones. If they start doing that, they're going to pave the way for much more malicious drones going around your neighborhood. And we know where that can end up. Not only that, he Jeff Bezos controlled the company like a dictator, like Mark Zuckerberg. These are these new CEOs. I call them corporate dictators. They're not only stripping shareholders of their rights, like a lot of CEOs do over the years. They strip their own owners of their rights, but they totally control the company. Zuckerberg developed a share holder system where the shares don't have votes. He has the votes. He has complete majority control. There can never be a shareholder revolt against Mark Zuckerberg's uh, um, Facebook or Meta or Instagram or what my sister called the way he treats and addicts and seduces children into the uh, internet gulag, uh, electronic child molesters. So these 12 CEOs who got it right, that's on the title of the book, really got it right. You can't do justice without reading the words, their own words. They were very verbal, very effusive for the most part. Some of them were more, you know, like the founder of Interface. He was more of an engineering laser beam. He could give good speeches, though. Then you had Robert Townsend, who wrote that great book, Up the Organization. He was the excoriator of corporate bureaucracy. And he had the most funny episodes and anecdotes. He was running Avis, and he created that slogan, we're number two, so we have to try harder. Number two to Hertz. But he went around chewing out all these executives at these business conventions because he said, you're stifling your employees. Your employees are your greatest feedback. Don't you understand that? And you're stifling them. And you don't even know where they are and who they are. You're up there in that cocoon of executive suite, surrounded by sycophants. That's why the book, Up the Organization, it's absolutely timely today. You should get it for your many bookstores, Andy.
So, I'm not sure about the answer to this, but I would guess that most of these CEOs do not have a business degree.
Yes, you're right. Anita Roddick ridiculed.
It's very interesting because I got my business degree later. I got it like 5 years ago. 5-6 years ago, and and I got it because I thought, you know what, I want to know if there's any other secrets that I didn't know about that businesses should know about.
Yeah.
And I remember sitting in the business class and thinking, this doesn't sound right. What they're teaching you isn't what's really happening on the ground.
Right.
And I remember I used to raise my hand all the time saying, I don't think this is how it works. And so the professor would say, if you're interested in social change, the public school policy is across the street. So for them, it was complete divorce. Business should be business as we know it, pure capitalism, ruthless capitalism. And if you are soft, you're considered a bad business person.
Which drove them into the financial industry for their students.
And finance was the key. Finance
making money from money, not making money from productive goods and services.
I don't know many happy business people that go into business because they want to sit behind a desk and crunch numbers. That is not my idea of joy. So the idea of sort of mixing business and politics is shunned upon in business schools. It's considered a no-no because if you take one side, you're blocking off a whole 50% of the population. And if you take the other side, and my theory is I don't need 50% of the population. I need just a few people to be able to fill up the room. You don't need to have everybody show up, you know?
So that raises another common feature. They didn't want conglomerates. People would say to Herb Keller, "You got a huge airline, buy a hotel chain, double up." He said, "I don't know a thing about hotels. Why should I double? Leave that to the hotel people." They didn't want to, and it's true for you. You could have had a chain starting around the country, but you knew the meaning of the word enough. And enough was the title of the book by one of my favorite CEOs who leads the book, John Bogle, who started Vanguard. And he wrote a thesis on mutual funds in his senior year at Princeton, 1951 or 2. And he went into the industry. He didn't like what he saw. Gouging fees, short-termism, not concerned about broader issues like underfunded pension funds and helping them out. And so he created Vanguard with no shareholders. It was a mutual, which means technically if you are a customer of Vanguard, you're a part owner. So he didn't have to be bothered by Wall Street twistifications of his mission. And he brought down the fee structure of the whole industry. It took quite a few years, but he kept growing and growing. He brought down the fee structure, which once you total it up with compound interest, is a huge slice over 20, 30 years of people's financial nest. And he would talk about that publicly all the time. And he finally, and he wrote a lot of books. In his final years, he wrote a book called Enough. And where did he get that word enough? Well, apparently there was a party in Long Island when a very prominent author was in the presence of a very prominent venture capitalist. And a friend of the author came up to him, to the author, and he said, "You see that guy there? He makes more in a week than you've made in all your royalties for all your books." And the author said, "Yeah, but I know something he doesn't know." And the friend said, "What?" He said, "I know the meaning of enough." And this book is a philosophical, concrete, all of examples by John Bogle. And when he published it, he gave it to every staff member of Vanguard all over the country. Thousands and thousands of books.
Sorry, Ralph. I'm trying to get the charger going here for a second. I wanted to ask you more specific, kind of more generally, speaking about the book. What prompted you to write it? I mean, most people, when they think of Ralph Nader, they don't think of corporate anything. You know, they think you are the anti-corporation person. You know, that, like you said, you know, bringing somebody like you into the boardroom can send chills down some you know, CEO's back. So what prompted you to write it to begin with?
Because all these CEOs of giant companies are defining their behavior by just responding to the market. Oh, we're just responding to the market. Get off our back. You know, we're selling goods and services, making profits for our shareholders. And there was no other yardstick about how to have a different business model, how to have a different level of humanity and sense of justice and treatment of workers and consumers and the community at large. And when you don't have these alternative yardsticks, you have whole generations of business students who think that the way these CEOs of big companies are doing it, that's the way it is. It's a dog-eat-dog world. Don't you know that? Yeah. And they begin inheriting the same type of planetary destructive legacy. Because now, you know, it's not just greed. It's not just excessive profits. It's not just excessive labor exploitation. It's the whole health of the planet, from the climate crisis to ocean deoxygenation to soil erosion. I mean, you know, the very firmaments of planet Earth are being shaken by these gigantic corporations who control so many governments, so much capital, so much technology. Imagine connecting an artificial person, which is what lawyers call corporations, with artificial intelligence. I mean, you want a deadly cocktail that can blow the world apart. There is a letter by Stephen Hawking, the famous scientist, and other scientists in 2014 that alarmed the world for 24 hours. And they basically said, if we don't control artificial intelligence or robots, they're going to destroy the earth and all the people in them, like autonomous weapons and so on. They'll replicate themselves. Well, in the last year, we've seen the beginning of what they call restorative artificial intelligence. And so we need yardsticks. We need these people like those 12 CEOs in my book, The Rebellious CEO, to measure their behavior, to have the media measure their behavior. There's another way to go, and they're making good profits, these alternative CEOs. That's another shared feature which you exhibit. They paid meticulous attention to profits, like you do to your restaurants with the murals and with the menus and the refinements and the ambience, and Anita Roddick, meticulous attention. And they all said, without profits, we can't do all this good work. We cannot broad framework of reference. We can't help people. So they've proven that the existing multinational global model is broken. It's devastating. It's corrosive of the human spirit. And it's getting worse with their control of these technologies. They're now raising our kids 5 to 7 hours a day on the iPhone, internet, gulag, seduction, addiction. I mean, imagine an abduction in human history other than slavery that penetrates millions of families, separates these children from their parents, their community, their nature. They're not playing outside anymore. The sidewalks are silent. You can have a book like Silent Spring, Silent Sidewalks. And so the frontiers of injustice are being expanded faster than I've ever seen. And we've got to have these kinds of yardsticks taught in the business schools, in the middle, millions of students who take business courses, and in community colleges, universities around the country. This book has suddenly gotten the attention of the UK press. I've given 4 interviews so far to the UK press. And it's not just they're interested in Anita Roddick, who started in the UK, the body shop. It's I think they're concerned. I think they're concerned that the value system of business today is heavily skewed, both making money from money, not investing, speculating, derivatives, all kinds of tiered speculation on Wall Street, using other people's money, misusing it, and runaway technologies. All kinds of new chemicals are being introduced, overdiagnosis with medical devices, excessive pharmaceutical use being pushed now. The fast food industry has pushed toward an epidemic of obesity. So now they have companies with anti-obesity drugs to make money off the obesity that is afflicting so many young people because of the junk food and junk drink. I mean, it's a vicious cycle. I hope this book is read a lot. I hope book clubs adopt it all over the country. And I hope that the press will pay attention to it. The press has a lot of space for business news and a lot of time on radio and TV, PBS, NPR, and there's no excuse for them not having this book front and center because it's good news. It's good news. It's not going after their advertisers like for the drug companies, DuPont or General Motors.
It's not the CEOs that got it wrong. It's the ones that got it right, which is always a good way to see things, right?
Right, exactly.
The one thing that we're seeing, though, I think on the bright side is that the young Gen Z, youngsters that are coming up into the workforce right now are looking for companies that do have that sense of social responsibility, that do have that sense of purpose that they want to align themselves with. So, that's an important aspect of the change that's taking place.
And if they see it discussed on TV and radio, they're going to find companies that they never knew existed to work with. And that's the whole point. The visibility of these 12 CEOs was not what it should be. Should have been far, far more visible. I mean, the first major company to go carbon neutral, He'd have a few articles here and there in the press, but most people never knew Ray Anderson.
Yeah.
Not to mention the others in the book. So it's important to ask your TV radio station, have interviews. A lot of these companies still have a legacy. Interface is still very active. Patagonia has gotten a new trust arrangement, and they're going great guns with their business model. And so, just demand that they stop degrading business news with, indices here and Federal Reserve excessive attention, the way Marketplace in the evening at NPR engages in. I mean, put some of these people who are breaking the models and who are often profiled in Inc. magazine or other magazines of entrepreneurship. Put them on the air, write about them more. And then more young people will see, hey, I didn't know that this company existed. I'm going to send my resume there.
I wanted to ask you, Ralph, how important is the founder, the CEO? I mean, for most of these CEOs have already passed away. There are 3 exceptions. Myself, I'm still here. The founder of Patagonia, Yvon Chouinard, and Paul Hogan.
Yeah.
So these are the 3 that are still here. Everybody else has passed away. What is the prognosis for these companies once their founder, the brainchild, the person who really birthed this organization is passed on?
Well, that's the most compelling question, because the question is, can these kind of companies emerge if they're not founded and run for a period of years? In other words, can you get any of these big companies to adopt these models? Because big companies are run by CEOs who are not founders. They've been around 100, 150 years. And my answer to that is yes, the business model is replicable in large companies. But it is true that these companies existed because of their founders' vision and their founders staying with it to success for a whole number of years, 30 years, 40 years, what have you. But the business model is still applicable to CEOs who inherit a legacy of bad tidings and want to change things.
The one thing I think that we talked earlier about the idea of having a measuring stick for these types of companies and see what ones are doing it right, which ones are not doing it so well, is the idea of B Corp and B Lab. I know you talk about that in the book a little bit. Can you speak a little bit about the significance of having an alternative corporate structure that sort of has the that element of social responsibility baked into its DNA?
Well, if you talk to Yvon Chouinard, he'd say, keep your companies private. Don't go public with shareholders. That way you can manage the vision. And you're not diverted. Your attention is not diverted to shareholders or others who just want higher profits and dividends. That's one model. Another model is the mutual model, which John Bogle, where you get rid of Wall Street on your back and all the speculation about how you have to get higher price per earnings. You have to buy back your stock instead of invest it in expanding the company or shoring up your underfunded pension fund or paying your workers more. The third model is worker owned. And some of these companies who were founded when the founder retired, he gave it to his workers. For example, a major auto dealer here, you probably know about him, John Fitzgerald. Go the Fitzway, the ads on TV. He's a big auto dealer. He's now transferring ownership of his many dealers in 3 states to his employees. So that's another model. Another model is cooperative ownership. That's where you have food co-ops, for example, where the consumers own the food store. And they're the board of directors. They're the ones who get the surplus, so-called because it's not profit making, they don't call it a dividend. So there are a lot of different models and ones that I haven't even envisioned. But the existing gigantic multinational corporate model where the CEOs decide their own salaries, they control the board of directors the way Boeing did and does. They strip the shareholders of any kind of oversight or feedback. They tell them you don't like the company, sell your stock. I mean, and if shareholders, institutional ones like pension funds say, I don't want to sell my stock. I want to have voice. Too bad. And so they basically have a dictatorial control, which leads to being surrounded by sycophants. You don't get the right feedback from the grassroots of your company, and as a result, you're clueless. I used to make airline reservations at night some years ago. You'll love this story. And you'd call American Airlines, United Airlines, Allegheny Airlines, and they'd put you on hold 5 minutes, 10 minutes, and they'd play music. If I wanted to hear, classical music, I'd, dial United Airlines, right? Nice music. And then, 30 minutes later, someone would come on, but they'd break the music by saying, your business is very important to us. Hold on. So I called up the head of Allegheny Airlines, who used to run United Airlines at the time. And I said, have you ever made an airline reservation? He said, no, of course not. I have the staff here. I said, you know what it's like? And I narrated the story. He said, really? I said, why don't you try to make an airline reservation yourself? Just pick up the phone and get back to me. So 3 weeks later, he gets back to me and he says, Ralph, I made several attempts to reserve an airline ticket and it's worse than you think. I've just hired 250 more people to man the phones. Didn't even know what was going on in his own company. The most simple factor, which is how quickly do these airlines respond when you're on the phone? Well, Southwest Airlines used to respond in less than 3 rings.
Wow.
They used to. Now they do put you on hold, but they tell you, when do you want us to call you back? And we will call you back, so you don't have to hang on the phone.
Yeah. Are there? I know it's a big world with lots of corporations out there. Are there ones that you would have included once the book was done? You thought maybe I could have included this one or that one. Like one company comes to mind, of course, is everybody knows Ben & Jerry's, but I know was bought up by Unilever. Was that the reason why you left them out?
Yes, that's the reason. One of the criteria was I really had to know a lot about these people over time, and that I had to have confidence in the product. And although I love ice cream, it's not exactly radishes, celery, and turnips.
And have vegan ice cream now, made with all kinds of vegetables and things that are not so bad for you.
And I admire Ben and Jerry enormously, but they fell to the same trick that Anita Roddick did. They were approached to go public on the grounds that they get more resources, they'll be able to expand, and they have more money to do their good work. And Ben & Jerry's did a lot of good work outside there. They were, for example, Ben Cohen was a leading critic of the Pentagon budget. He had a bus, he'd go right across the country, showing people the bloated nature, the corruption, how it diverts from rebuilding their own community because it's eating up over 50% of the operating budget of the federal government. Well, Anita Roddick learned the hard way that the company took it over. They started canceling some of their policies and their models. It didn't turn out well at all. And Ben & Jerry's, they got a clause in the takeover where that the company was a Dutch multinational that took them over, that they would have to adhere to a lot of the practices and whimsies of Ben & Jerry's, which you can still see when you buy Ben & Jerry's, but it's not the same. Ben & Jerry's now is an ice cream company, and Ben & Jerry are consultants, but they're not reaping the resources where say Ben Cohen would have started Pentagon watchdog citizen groups all over the country. They couldn't do that. So that is one of the problems in the book, is when they are successful and they have great visions for expanding their civic framework, uh, they get induced to go public with all kinds of promises that aren't enforceable, and then they regret it, and then they'll leave. But you asked a question about others. Progressive Insurance was one of the biggest auto insurers. It was built by a classmate of mine at Princeton, Peter Lewis, and he priced his products pretty high. However, look at the other things he did. He was a peace advocate, and he was against endless wars, and he worked with George Soros on that. Number two, he was the biggest contributor by far to the ACLU. And number three, he supported the arts in Cleveland, where Progressive was based, and around the country. Number four, it took me one lunch with him to get him early on to convert his auto fleet with airbags. And he was the second company after Travelers to convert the airbags. I said to him, boy, you know, there is a upside to corporate hierarchies, isn't there, Peter? Like, whatever you say, bingo, it gets done. But he adopted another thing that people can still see in progressive ads. He had comparative ads comparing auto rates with Progressive auto rates, State Farm, Nationwide, Allstate. And there were times when he didn't come first. He didn't come out first. He encouraged people to comparison shop. And that was a tremendous breakthrough in insurance company advertising. And that took another lunch. Sometimes, it pays to have classmates who do well in business because you can get right through to him. He would answer his phone immediately. By the way, another aspect of all these entrepreneurs, they return calls, except one or two that I know. It takes a long time to get a call returned, but most of them return calls. In fact, Bob Townsend would reserve 11 to 12 every morning, and he'd return all the calls. He'd bunch them, and he'd return all his calls. I once asked one of them, why did he return all the calls? He said, that's how I get feedback about what's going on right and wrong in my business. Well, it's so obvious, isn't it? But it escapes.
I have several friends that call me directly. If there's a problem while they're sitting there, they'll send me a text or call me, and I'm always appreciative. I give out my cell number to anyone.
Well, what do you do when someone says the dinner I just ordered is cold and I don't want it anymore? Take it back. What's your policy?
We comp it.
And what's your policy with the customer? The customers are still there at the table.
We'll replace it with a fresh one, and we don't have them pay for it.
That's it. See, it's my dad did that when that happened. And that's very rarely done by big business. Very rarely done.
It's funny because a lot of people believe that if you do that, people will take advantage of it, and that's why they don't do it. That's not necessarily true. In the scheme of things, most people aren't going to try to scam you. Most people are there to have a nice meal, and when the meal isn't quite right, they're there to let you know. And I always think, when people tell me that something is wrong, I thank them, because if they don't tell me, most of the time what people do is they walk away and never come back.
Yeah.
So when they call me and tell me something is wrong, it means they care enough and that they're willing to expend the time and the energy to let me know. So that's really remarkable.
Tell us about your civic events and your bookstore, so people streaming can understand what I meant when I said you broke the traditional restaurant model.
I mean, we're constantly trying to do things that are relevant to the community. So whether it's, for instance, right now with all of the atrocities that are happening in Gaza by Israeli troops, we actually host events around that issue. We host events about what are war crimes, being committed. We bring together Arabs and Jews to talk about these issues. We call them peace cafes, where people come and can share their, feelings, experiences, emotions about what's happening. I always say that oftentimes, just sitting in front of the television and in front of your little screen isolates people. And sometimes you really need to have the face-to-face in order for you to, have a connection with humanity. One of the reasons why I opened Busboys and Poets really was after 9/11, when I felt as an Arab, as a Muslim living in this country, very isolated. And I was really getting concerned about this country that has adopted me, but yet I don't feel like I belong. And so creating a place like this and then seeing the number of people that walked in and the number of events we were having and how many people were, excited about getting involved and getting engaged really restored my faith in this country and in America, honestly. So for me, it was a personal, crusade to be able to open this and make it happen. When I saw the impact that face-to-face interactions have on people, and having a bookstore and educating people and getting the right speakers and folks that continue to push the envelope on so many issues, really does bring about change. I mean, that's, oftentimes you don't see it right away. You don't see it that, year or next year or the year after, but over time, you do see a difference. And sometimes when there's a spark, that change you've created over time rises to the top,
Well, you had a memorial event for Howard Zinn. They were lined up down the street.
Yeah.
They couldn't find the space for it. And you don't avoid controversial subjects. In fact, you look for controversial subjects. You don't have events just saying, well, here's something that will help improve some easy charity, which maybe deserve it. No, you take on the hard issues. And how did you integrate your bookstores? Tell us about that.
Well, I used to be involved with an organization called Teaching for Change. You may know them. They bring civics education and DEI type of standards to schools, high schools mostly, high school, middle schools. I was on their board for many years. This is back in the 90s. And I remember they used to put out a catalog every year of the best civic books and history books on issues that are important for that time. And I remember getting that brochure and circling the books I want, then filling out the little card, putting an envelope, putting a check with it, and mailing it, and then waiting for that box to arrive. A couple of weeks later, it was so exciting when they opened that box and find these beautiful books in there. And I remember, once I started thinking of Busboys and Poets, I said, I want that experience in the store. So I talked to Teaching for Change, the board, and they had never done this. I said, have you thought of putting a bookstore in a space? I said, I will put the shelves. I will pay for everything in there. All you have to do is pay for the books and the staff. You don't have to pay for electricity, rent, nothing. Just bring in the staff and the books. And they said, that sounds like a deal we can't refuse. And it was a handshake deal. We never had really a contract or anything like that. We shook hands. We filled up the place, and sure enough, it was a magnet. People would come, and even people that were not thinking of buying a book suddenly get exposed to certain books, and they'll pick one up. We have some of the best children books ever because we don't have the typical Mother Goose type books, but we have books that really deal with current topics and current issues for young minds. So we have that. We have a lot of authors, of course, have come through because of the bookstore. So it's been a real important element of Busboys and Poets, and we have them in every one of our locations now.
And there's a collateral benefit, which is when your dining room is full and people have to wait, they browse the bookstore.
Absolutely. I remember we used to put people on a wait, and sometimes they would say, okay, your table is ready. They say, go ahead and take the next one. I'm too busy with the book. So it's really exciting to see the engagement people have with the bookstore.
But I want to reverse this interview for a minute, Andy. And I want to just say that Saul Price, for example, advocated a wealth tax. He's like close to a billionaire. He would go to Congress and urge senators, representatives to put a wealth tax, a 1% wealth tax. He also was very critical of grand juries because he thought they were secret and one-sided. And as someone once said, you can indict a ham sandwich in a grand jury. and he would put a full-page ads in the LA Times criticizing the grand jury procedure because he was a lawyer originally out of New York. What is the future for Andy Shallal? I mean, you're involved in so many areas and issues that I point out in this book and try to describe a bewildering number of issues, crises affecting the District of Columbia, an advocate for statehood, of course, and dealing with the labor crisis during the pandemic. I can't imagine what you have to go through during the pandemic, the COVID virus. What do you see for the next round of Andy Shallal?
Well, I want to maintain my activism. I think I've been, doing a lot of lobbying in Congress, particularly of late around the war in Gaza, asking for Congresspeople to ask for a ceasefire, which would seem like a no-brainer, but apparently it's a very controversial issue to tell people to stop killing babies. So I'm working very hard on that. I'm also working with local politics. I am now chairing, for instance, a candidate, an incumbent that's running for at-large seat here in Washington, D.C., Robert White, whom I like very much and had run for mayor before. So I'm involved in politics on different levels, and really kind of at this point working very hard to raise money for candidates. I'd love to see money out of politics, but right now that's not the case, unfortunately. And so we have to keep making sure that those who are standing up for the right thing aren't pushed aside. It's very difficult for people like Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar and Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez and people like that are Cori Bush and others who are constantly putting their neck out there and having millions upon millions of dollars come at them from every which direction to try to unseat them. So want to make sure that we continue to support those people, not just with our rallies and applause and retweets, but also with real hard cash that they absolutely need in order for them to get their message out. So trying to amplify the message of those that I believe are trying to make a world a better place. I think
our positions on the Israeli-Gaza-Palestinian issue are on our website. Go to nader.org. You see my columns. You'll see strong letters to President Biden by Bruce Fein and me, and you'll see some letters to members of Congress. They're not routine letters. They're full of very specific information for those of you who want to pick up on this, because what's going on over there has a potential flaring beyond those borders. It's already importing police state tactics against protesters in this country, in the way they're treating peaceful protesters, retaliation against their employment prospects, forcing them out of their jobs. So this whole Israeli imperial position in the Middle East over the years has brought an impact on our politics as well. It made the rights of Palestinians completely unable to be discussed on Capitol Hill. Notice since 1948, Andy, the leading peace advocates in Israel, Israeli peace advocates, their former ministers of justice, mayor of Haifa, former security and intelligence leaders who disagree with Netanyahu and his right-wing coalition, that over all those years, they've never had a single congressional hearing of the peace movement in Israel. Often very collaborative with Palestinian peace advocates and groups like Beth Salem and their counterparts in Palestine. It's such a rigid dogma of censorship.
Yeah. I think there's something really dangerous happening, which is conflating Israeli policy, fascist right-wing policy with anti-Semitism. The critiquing Israeli policy with anti-Semitism, I think, is a terrible and very dangerous movement and a gamble that people like Netanyahu and others are taking. because it's really not making us safer, not making Jewish people safer, not making Muslims safer, not making anyone safer, and certainly not making Americans safer, or Palestinians for that matter. So it's not boding well. But I know we're coming toward the closing time for this conversation. I always love talking to you, Ralph, because your thinking is always outside the box, and the box keeps getting smaller. And so it's wonderful to be able to escape from that and be able to hear fresh ideas. You've been doing this for decades now, this advocacy work, this social responsibility work, working with corporations and individuals and members of Congress. So do you see, is it getting harder to do what you do? Or do you feel with the advent of social media and the impact that you can have through that, or do you feel like it's becoming easier in that there's a whole, opportunities have opened up because of that?
Much harder. No comparison with the 60s and 70s. Congress has somersaulted into the lap of 1,500 giant corporations. Money swarms over members of Congress. They great people in Congress who got the environmental, consumer, OSHA, EPA, all these through civil rights, civil liberties. Their successors can't stand a candle to them. Many of them are vicious people, like Senator Tom Cotton, who is a graduate of the Harvard Law School, who said he wouldn't mind to see the rubble bounce in Gaza. Graham saying, finish them all off. These are homicidal maniacs that are senators and representatives. There's almost no compassion for the downtrodden, either in our country or around the world. Republicans blocked the extension of the child tax credit that cut child poverty by almost 40% in this country. They blocked it in January 2022. They're blocking full health insurance. They're blocking raising the $7.25 federal minimum wage. They're bloating the military budget. They're blocking public works and infrastructure. They want a tax system where the super rich and the corporate pay far, far less taxes than an ordinary electrician or a restaurant server. There's no comparison, Andy.
So
and then what's happened back home is that people have gotten disillusioned, and instead of resurging, except for the recent events, instead of resurging, they're withdrawing and giving up. There's an article in the New York Times a few weeks ago saying the American people watching what's going on in Washington are so withdrawing that they don't even bother complaining anymore. That's a very dangerous signal.
That is very. So what do you see? What do you see the way out? What do you see the way out of this? Is it getting money out of politics? Is it a third party? I know you ran as a third party candidate. Do you see that as a possibility? So that's the final question. So leave us with something a little bit on a high, Ralph. Just
I'll leave you with 535 members of Congress commanding the most powerful institution in the world. Look what they're doing to the world. With the most constitutional authority to turn our executive branch and White House and judiciary around. And there's 535 of them. And all the protests for justice in this country and against injustice, the vast majority of them have to go through Congress. They're either being blocked by Congress, like frozen minimum wage, or they can be facilitated, like expanding public infrastructure and jobs. And so I would urge all people to start with a very important principle of democracy. Almost every major advance in justice in our country's history never required more than 1% of the people to be engaged on three principles. One, they knew what they were talking about and they were accurate. Two, they represented public opinion or growing public opinion, oftentimes left-right support, as there is for health insurance, cracking down on corporate crooks, a new tax system, a living wage. And three, this is the key, they didn't just have marches and demonstrations, and the energy went into the ether on a weekend. They zeroed in on Congress or the state legislature. Congress and the state legislatures are the pivots for the American people to turn this country around. That's the way our constitutions are structured. And so I urge you, do not have your energies fritter away into the ether. When you have marches, have pictures of your senators and representatives. Pass out information about them. And that's what I leave people with. We regulated the auto industry in the 60s with less than 1,000 people around the country because we focused on committees in Congress. And let me leave you with the current thought. Have you ever seen AIPAC or the NRA launch great marches of protest? They don't mess around with that. They don't mess around with demonstrations. They focus on the senator, the representative, the staffers, the doctors, lawyers, accountants, golf buddies of the senators and representatives. Laser beam. That's what I leave you with. You outnumber them. There are only 535 of them. They're shaped by 1,500 corporations. None of them have a vote. You have the vote. You have the we the people, sovereignty in the Constitution. It doesn't start with we the Congress or we the corporation. What are you waiting for?
Ralph Nader, thank you so much. Rebellious CEO, 12 companies that did it right, 12 leaders who did it right. And it's a great read. It's an easy read. It's a fun read, honestly. And we will have it ready at Busboys and Poets. We'll have it signed by Ralph. So please pick one up at your closest location. We look forward to seeing you hopefully much more in the future. And I look forward to talking to you again on Zoom with these conversations. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you very much, Andy. Shallal, one of our 12 CEO rebels.
Yeah.
And give the book to your library. They're hurting in their budgets. Give it to your library, your friends and relatives. It's a great Thanksgiving book.
Thank you so much. Take care.
You're welcome.